Hi, this is Mark Farnham with Apologetics for the Church and the Every Believer Confident podcast. Today we want to answer the question, can science explain everything? In fact, John Lennox, the Irish Oxford mathematician and scholar, has written a book entitled, Can Science Explain Everything? Because there are some people you meet who think that science has disproved Christianity. They think that science has clearly shown that the Christian gospel is not true and that the Bible is not true. But of course, for every one of those objections raised by science, there are good answers. The question is, can you find those answers? Because they are out there. And we want to rather ask the question, does science give us the ultimate truth that stands above every other claim to truth? And I would argue the answer is no. Science is a wonderful gift from God to know our world, to study and to cultivate and to develop all the potential God put into the earth, into the universe. But science cannot answer everything. And when you meet people sometimes who think that science can answer everything, it's good to use these talking points. I'm going to give you 8 limitations of science. That is 8 things that make us realize science is not always right, that those who claim to be speaking the scientific truth are sometimes wrong, and the fact that science is just limited in its ability to tell us the truth about our world. So the first limitation is this: science can only address the natural world. That is, science cannot render any judgment on immaterial things like God, the soul, or even just the essence of the world. Those are all what we would call metaphysical realities, and science is limited to speaking about the physical realities in our world, the material realities. Secondly, all scientific data has to be interpreted. That is, when scientists study something, when they discover something or look through a microscope or a telescope or do a mathematical equation or run a chemical experiment, they conclude data, but that data then has to be interpreted. How are we going to see this? How are we going to place this in the overall picture of the knowledge that we have? And that's where error can come in interpretation. Because 2 scientists can look at the same thing and arrive at different interpretations of the data. And that leaves open room for error or just mistaken ideas. Thirdly, science must constantly revise and rescind its former pronouncements. We saw that clearly in the COVID and post-COVID era, where at the time we were told this is the best way to deal with COVID. And then sometimes just a few weeks or months later, we were told, no, that's wrong, now do this. And increasingly as time goes on, we realize that scientists, as they gain more information, more facts, that they change their pronouncements. And therefore, when they made the previous pronouncements, they were wrong. So science has to continually revise and rescind its pronouncements. Fourthly, science is always done by finite, flawed, and biased people. That is, science is not some mystical activity done by gods or demigods that can never be wrong. Scientists are tempted by pride, greed, corruption, just like any other person. And there are plenty of stories out there in the scientific world that document this. For example, recently the Wall Street Journal ran an article that said there's a flood of fake science that's out there, and as a result, a number of medical journals, scientific journals, had to close down because they were not vetting the science. See, the idea that science is done in a pristine way and every experiment, every paper, every conclusion is tested by multiple people to make sure it's true and not wrong or flawed is simply not the case. That happens sometimes, but the vast majority of scientific pronouncements and papers are not double-checked by anyone. And as a result, then, there is a flood of fraud and of error. Here's an example of error. Recently, a Nobel Prize-winning scientist, Greg Semenza, has had to retract 13 different papers that he's published that help him win the Nobel Prize. Why? Because he discovered he was wrong about those things. He made miscalculations. So science is limited because it is done by finite, flawed, and biased people. Number 5, science must be funded and so is influenced by money. That is, science is incredibly expensive. My son used to work in a laboratory in one of the big pharmaceutical and chemical companies in the United States. And the laboratory was full of multiple machines that cost hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. Many scientific experiments require millions, if not tens of millions of dollars. And therefore, science is affected by money. Sometimes money steps in and provides scientific conclusions that are influenced and turn out to be wrong. A good example is the sugar industry funding studies back in the 60s and 70s. So you would see advertisements that would say things like, make sure your kids get their 1 to 2 cups of sugar a day to stay healthy. Well, now we know those studies were funded by the sugar industry and are completely wrong. There's a whole history of mistaken and money-influenced ideas in science that were later exposed as false. Number 6, scientists disagree all the time about all kinds of things. Now, I'm not talking about the basic ideas of the distance between the Earth to the moon or the Earth to the sun or the way to measure gravity, but many, many other things that science claims to be true. You find disagreement among scientists. Again, another example of that is during COVID. The number of scientists that published the Barrington Declaration disagreeing with how the U.S. was handling COVID. And those people were, those scientists, those doctors were blacklisted, were squashed. Their ideas were quashed and hidden because it did not fit the narrative. Well, that's one of the problems, is that scientists sometimes disagree with other scientists, and sometimes politics and money and power come into play to hide those different ideas. But there are many things in science where scientists disagree all the time. Number 7, a 7th limitation of science, is the catastrophic failure of engineered products that scientists have approved. That is, whether it's a bridge, an automobile, a child's toy, medication. At some point, scientists signed off on that and said, this is safe, this is good. And then later there is a recall. Well, that's one of the limitations of science, is how is it possible that scientists approved of these things and then retracted them later? And that again speaks to the limitations of science. Sometimes they get things wrong. The most famous thing probably is the 1986 space shuttle explosion shortly after takeoff, where hundreds of scientists approved the launch. Several tried to stop it. The experts in, for example, the rubber O-rings that connected the different parts of the space shuttle and the fuel rockets, they protested, but they were overruled. And as a result, then the nation watched on live TV as the space shuttle blew up. Well, that's a big question of how could that happen? And it's because sometimes the things that scientists approve turn out to fail. Think about the bridge collapse in Minneapolis a few years ago. And we could go on with airplanes, medications, all those kinds of things. Even the idea of asbestos, that at one time was given the A-OK by scientists. So that's one of the limitations of science, is sometimes scientists think that something is safe when in fact it is not. And then finally, number 8, the 8th limitation of science, is the great evils done in the name of science. Whether we're talking about Nazi Germany, which was the most, if maybe one of the most advanced nations on earth scientifically, and they used that science for evil, to seek to take over the world and to commit genocide. Scientists were key in the development of the execution of millions of Jews and how to do that most efficiently. Think also about frontal lobotomies that were practiced in the 1960s and 70s until the practice was banned, approved as a legitimate way to treat hyperactive children or depressed housewives. Now we look back on that and realize that was a great evil, and many people were damaged by such a thing. We could go on to eugenics. 100 years ago, eugenics began in the United States and actually spread to Germany and other areas, in which we were told by the most cutting-edge evolutionary scientists that lesser races should be managed and we can engineer the perfection of humanity. All that was done by the greatest scientists of the day. So when you look at these 8 limitations of science, it reminds us again that science is not the answer for everything. Science, we could add one more. Science cannot determine morals. Just because science can help us build a bomb doesn't tell us whether we should drop that on someone. So science is limited. It's a wonderful gift from God to know our world. And yet anyone who would argue that science has all the answers clearly does not understand the very limitations of science. I hope this helps you if you encounter someone who believes that science has all the answers. Just to show you how practical this was, a few years ago I was preaching at a church and I mentioned the limitations of science. And afterwards, someone came up to me, a practicing scientist, and he said, listen, I would love to believe in God, but my understanding of science keeps me from doing that. And I asked him, I said, well, what about the limitations of science? And he was unaware of any limitations. And I began to list them. I think I only got through 3 or 4 of the limitations. And he stopped me and he said, okay, I see what you're saying. I realize that science is not an objection to God or to the Christian faith. And I was astounded that just by listing these limitations, he came to realize that science does not have all the answers. So I hope this helps you as you talk to people, as you share the gospel, that you would be encouraged that if you encounter someone who believes science is an objection to Christianity, it really isn't. If you enjoyed this video and would like to find more resources on apologetics, go to apologeticsforthechurch.org.